Everybody, thanks so much for Thank you so much for being here today with us. We're thrilled to be here to tell you more about our 2025 Housing Justice Peer Network. My name is Jessica Yeager. I'm the Director of National Housing Initiatives at the Center for Justice Innovation, and I'm here with my colleagues from the Housing Solutions Lab at the NYU Furman Center. Next slide, please. So our plan for the next 45 minutes is we're going to tell you about some research we've done exploring partnerships between housing and criminal justice policymakers. We're going to tell you about the network opportunity. We're going to highlight the value that the Lab and CJI can offer if we're working with your jurisdictions. So hopefully you'll be excited to apply. And then, of course, we will save time at the end to respond to any questions that you have. Next slide. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about the Center for Justice Innovation, which is where I work. The Center for Justice Innovation is a community justice organization, and you can see our core values listed here. For more than 3 decades, we've worked with communities and legal systems and governments to build community-led responses to violence. We've worked in jurisdictions across the country at all levels of government, using our experience and our expertise to help communities figure out the approaches that best fit their needs and aspirations. There are 3 pillars of our work. First, we operate projects in communities and courts focused on community safety and justice system reform. These include community courts, diversion and other reform programs embedded in traditional courts, and community justice centers. We also support reform efforts in other places, nationally working in all 50 states and also internationally through training and technical assistance. We provide support to jurisdictions on systems change that focuses on access to justice, community justice, tribal justice, behavioral health, gender-based violence, and housing, which is the work I lead. And then finally, we conduct research on cutting-edge issues related to the criminal justice system and community safety. So that's the Center for Justice Innovation. And next, I will hand things over to my colleague, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia. I'm our Director of New Research Partnerships at the Lab. And I'm just going to say a few words about the Lab in case you're not familiar. So we are based at the NYU Furman Center. Our mission is to work with cities, especially small and mid-sized cities, to plan, launch, and evaluate housing policy with the goal of advancing racial equity, health, and well-being. And we do this in a variety of ways, but really at the core of what we do is engaging with cities to help them think through their housing challenges, both through peer learning and through direct technical assistance. So to date, we've convened, I think, around 12 cohorts of cities through full-scale networks, through workshops, through communities of practice, and these have really run the gamut in terms of who participated and which housing challenge they tackled. We're increasingly interested in structuring our cohorts to foster cross-sectoral work. And so this Housing Justice Peer Network is our first foray into that. The Lab also publishes a great deal of information about housing policies, along with tools for practitioners. You can check those out at our website, localhousingsolutions.org. And finally, being embedded within the Furman Center lets us do really high-powered research and evaluation in partnership with cities to learn more about which policies work and which don't. Next slide. So now, as Jessie mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our recent collaborative research. I'll start off by saying that I think the links between housing insecurity and criminal justice involvement are really well documented. We've all seen a cycle like this or something similar before. We know that justice-involved people are at much higher risk of housing instability, and that in turn, housing insecure people are at much higher risk of interacting with the criminal justice system and experiencing bad outcomes. Next slide. So our goal with this research was not to further document that cycle. Rather, our goal was to look at where housing and criminal justice practitioners are working together to disrupt that cycle. We wanted to know, where are there interesting innovations happening? Why do some collaborations work? And on the flip side, what is getting in the way of cross-sector partnerships in other instances. So together, CJI and the lab conducted a program scan, drawing on our respective national networks. From there, we conducted interviews with 32 practitioners across the country, and we also fielded a survey of criminal justice agencies. And so I'm going to tell you what we learned in a nutshell. Our first key takeaway is that solutions do exist. With a problem of this magnitude, it's really easy for us to throw up our hands and say, look, affordable housing is scarce, we're in a housing crisis, lots of people face barriers, justice-involved people may be the greatest barriers of all. But we found that in diverse places around the country, there are innovative things happening to move the needle. And so we wanted to highlight those solutions. And ultimately, we organized them into 4 buckets. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each of those. The first bucket is stopping or limiting justice system involvement before it happens. Because as we all know, the best way to address housing consequences of justice involvement is to prevent justice system involvement in the first place. So these are programs that divert people away from the system and connect them to resources like housing that help them avoid future involvement. So one example I'll highlight here is law enforcement assisted diversion, or LEAD. We looked at this in Seattle, but it exists in a whole bunch of places. And essentially, law enforcement personnel work directly with the homelessness response coordinated entry system to give justice-involved people a priority for homelessness prevention services. Next slide. A second bucket we distill in the report are programs that connect justice-involved people to resources and support. So programs like this recognize that there are lots of different touch points in the criminal legal system, and those are places where we can identify and potentially address housing needs. So an example of this is HSYNC, or Housing Stability for Youth in Courts, which is a partnership between juvenile courts and local service providers that operates in 4 counties in Washington state. And they identify youth in juvenile court who are at risk of homelessness or maybe are already experiencing homelessness and connect them or their families to housing services. A third approach is expanding access to existing housing. This can be done in a couple of different ways. You can remove barriers to housing, or you can prioritize justice-involved people for existing housing resources. So an example of the former would be fair chance laws, which limit the use of criminal background information when people are applying for housing. An example of the second is the frequent user service enhancement, or FUSE model, which is a collaboration between corrections departments and homeless services that identifies who is using both those systems most frequently and then prioritizes them for supportive housing. And here's the final bucket, maybe the hardest, actually increasing housing supply. Naturally, to address the lack of affordable housing, we need to build more housing, and that's not easy to do. But there are places who are managing to do not just that, but to build housing that is specifically for justice-involved people. So the Homecoming project is an example that I'll highlight here, but Just Home is really worth looking at as well. The Homecoming project is a home sharing model where people agree to rent a room in their home to a person who's reentering from prison. And then the program provides support to both the tenant and the landlord to make sure that that match is successful. So our goal with developing these 4 buckets was to show that there's not a single solution here, and that many of these solutions actually don't involve creating new housing resources necessarily. A second key takeaway, though, is that the cross-sector collaborations that you need to stand up these solutions, they're hard. Many people we talked to reported the same set of core challenges. not enough political will to take action. Misaligned incentives between agencies, especially when one agency is kind of bearing the cost of doing something and a different agency might be benefiting the most. We saw data sharing barriers. It can be really hard to align information from very different data systems. And then finally, just very different cultures, different ways of speaking, different funding streams for housing and criminal justice agencies, which can make it hard for them to work together. With that said, our third key takeaway is that many collaborations do succeed, and these are some critical elements in the success stories that we heard. First, not surprising, finding ways to align goals. Second, getting stakeholders engaged early and often. And there are different ways to do that. Sometimes solving a problem for a key stakeholder is a great way of developing trust and interest. Third, relationships really matter. So creating political will, getting buy-in, it's not about two systems necessarily. It's building trust between two people. And finally, the right team is absolutely key. People with lived experience being involved in both program design and implementation, we saw could be really important. And then having innovators in roles where they actually have decision-making power is key. And so that's a short summary of our research. Our goal now is to apply these learnings and our respective expertise to the Housing Justice Peer Network. And I'm going to turn it back to Jessie to tell you more about that opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Claudia. So we're thrilled to tell you more about the Housing Justice Peer Network. So as Claudia said, our two organizations will be running this network together, building off our shared interest in breaking down the silos between the housing and criminal justice fields in our own work and in the wider world. And we're also building off our organization's experience with these issues ourselves, and also all that we've learned during the research project exploring them that you just heard about from Claudia. So I'm going to go over some of the details you see on the slide, sort of the high-level details here. We will select between 8 and 10 teams to participate in the network, and each team should have about 3 or 4 people. The teams must have people who work on housing and/or homelessness and people who work in the criminal justice system. The teams also should be government-led, though not all team members need to necessarily work for government. The network will last for 16 months, starting in April 2025 and ending in July 2026. And finally, there's no fee for participating. Our time is being funded by foundations. Thank you to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Schusterman Family Philanthropies. Next slide. So what will the peer network achieve? The network is an opportunity for jurisdictions to build cross-sector partnerships to tackle problems resulting in that homelessness carceral cycle that Claudia just mentioned. We see the cross-sector relationship building and joint exploration of common issues as just as important as the solutions development process that will be part of this. But obviously that's important too, and the network will really be an opportunity to do both, to build that multidisciplinary team in what we hope will be an enduring way, and then to work together to pursue a specific goal, which will help you develop over our time working together. Next slide. So I'm going to tell you now a little bit about what the process will look like. So the opportunity is a 16-month period divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 is cohort learning. So that will be 6 months of monthly meetings with the full cohort. The goal of phase 1 is to get each individual team, to the place where they can pick a specific problem and possible solutions that they want to explore during phase 2. And I'll tell you more about phase 2 in a minute. Phase 1 will involve team building, both for the site teams and for the cohort as a whole. And then it will involve building shared knowledge about housing and criminal justice systems, data, structure, acronyms, about challenges and barriers, about successful solutions around the country, and about working with communities of partners and stakeholders. During phase 1, a lot of the work will happen in the cohort meetings. but there will also be work between the meetings for each site, and our team will meet with each site individually to support that between the cohort meetings. So during phase 1, each month, you should expect to spend 2 hours in a cohort meeting, an hour or so on a call with us, and some time doing prep work. Moving on to phase 2. Phase 2 is focused on individual site policy or reform development. This phase lasts for 10 months and involves individual site work resulting in an implementation plan for a specific solution. The goal of phase 2 is that for each jurisdiction's team to investigate and develop a holistic plan for implementing a solution to the problem they've chosen to address. And phase 2 will have 3 phases. The first phase is a learning phase where each site will investigate in more depth the problem you've selected to work on. This will involve identifying needed stakeholders and partners and engaging with them. It will involve data analysis and data needs analysis, system and resource mapping, etc. The next phase is a problem and solution definition phase, where you'll take all that you've learned and you'll define the problem clearly and then ideate solutions with your core team and possibly a wider set of partners and stakeholders as well. During this phase, you'll work to explore feasibility of possible solutions and then ultimately pick one. And finally, we'll move into a planning phase once you've picked a solution. Here, you'll move from brainstorming and exploration to concrete planning, making plans to address fiscal, regulatory, legal, organizational, cultural barriers, whatever barriers exist, and identifying the sequence of steps needed for implementation. Throughout all of this, we will be helping to guide the process, providing you with tools that you can use to do the work, and connecting you to other resources that you may need, like subject matter experts. And in the end, each site will have developed a specific, detailed implementation plan that provides an actionable blueprint for moving forward. The first cohort meeting will be in April, but we'll meet with sites starting in March just to do some prep work for that first meeting. Next slide. Okay, who's eligible? So a little bit more on this. We're looking for teams of 3 to 4 people, and the teams need to be made up of people who work on housing and homelessness, or housing or homelessness, and also people who work in the criminal justice system. We know and expect that you'll need more than 3 or 4 people ultimately to do this work, but at this point, we're looking for you to identify the 3 or 4 people who will be the core folks leading the process. We're also expecting that people from government will be the leads, because at the end of the day, this is really focused on government and reforms, but other people can be on the team if that's helpful or necessary. Any level of government is welcome. Local, county, states is not only for cities, and also any population size is welcome. The lab, in some of its other work, focuses on small and mid-sized cities. That's not the case for this project. And then finally, we're looking for early stage partnerships. And there's no precise definition here, but we're looking to help build these partnerships, and we're going to spend a fair bit of time on that. So if you already all work together and have integrated systems, you are not going to need a lot of what we're going to be spending time on. Next slide. And then finally, what's the application process? So the application is up online. Its application deadline is February 14th. After that, we'll be doing interviews with some finalists, and then hope to announce selected sites in early March. Next slide. And then we just wanted to point out that there are a number of documents that you should review if you're interested in applying for this opportunity. We're going to show you just a couple of screenshots here of those. This here is the call for applications, which has lots of detail about the network and what to expect. Next slide. This document is a preview of the application questions, so you can be reviewing that and working on it before you actually log into the application portal. Next slide. And then finally, we've created a frequently asked questions document where we're adding questions as we get them over email. This webinar is being recorded and will also be posted to that page, so folks can share that or go back and look at it later. Great, and that's the overview. there's two emails and names here that are, we have Jess Wunsch from the lab and I are the point people for questions if they come up after today, but now we're happy to open it up to questions. If folks have questions about the opportunity, you can just drop them in the Q&A and we will answer them.
Right, great. Like Jesse said, keep on putting your questions in the Q&A function and we'll get to all of them that we can throughout the next few minutes. But I'll be happy to facilitate the questions for Claudia and Jesse. So first, I'll kind of pose to you that, there may be some folks who are interested in applying for this opportunity, but they may not have funding yet for a specific project or a specific initiative. What do you have to say to folks who may be in that boat, and how is this opportunity relevant to them?
I can jump in on that one. Thank you, Aisha. So we, part of the benefit of this being working at an early stage is that, we certainly don't expect that people will come in with specific ideas or specific budgets already set for, the work that they'll be planning for. I think that can absolutely be part of the planning process, is thinking about, budget and advocacy around that as part of the planning process that we'll engage in.
Great, thank you, Jesse. We do have a question from an audience member asking if this will be our first cohort. Claudia or Jesse, would you like to take that?
Sure. I mean, for the lab, this will be our first cohort focusing on cross-sectoral partnerships and housing and criminal justice in particular, but we have lots of previous experience with cohorts. We've done 12 different cohorts that have tackled different housing challenges in our 3-year history, and we're really excited for this one.
Thanks. Will there be follow-up technical assistance with the cohort after the initial TA to check in to see if goals have been accomplished?
After the 16-month period is what I'm assuming the question is referring to. And I think that is somewhat to be determined. It's not currently part of the plan, but it potentially could be.
Thank you. So we have another question that asks, is it okay to apply even if you don't have the entire team? For example, if they're building affordable housing, do they have to find government partners to apply?
We would definitely like to see a full team. At the minimum, there needs to be a team lead who can serve as the contact person for the application. And we really are looking for 3 to 4 team members. We emphasize that it would be important to have government agency folks. But if you read the call for applications, we also say that we'd be willing to consider other structures if you make a strong case for them.
What if you're working on the intersection of criminal justice and housing already? Can you still participate if you already had policy that died in committee last year?
Yeah, so people, like I said during the presentation, we don't have a very strict definition for what we mean by early stage, but that there will be a fair bit of time spent on the team building aspect within each team, getting, people going through processes of learning and, both generally and in the specific sites about the housing system and the criminal legal system and building that cross-sector understanding together. So I think that if folks have been working with their counterparts for a long time, that might not be very, as valuable, and which is why we have focused on early stage partnerships. But certainly encourage folks to apply if that sounds of interest.
Great. I think building off of that, with the mention of early partnerships, we have another question that's asking if established partnerships that still struggle with barriers, I assume, to housing people with criminal justice histories, can they still apply for this opportunity?
Yes, I think they absolutely can.
Okay, and then a little more clarification on the team size, it looks like. Are teams 3 to 4 people, or are they 3 to 4 agencies wanting to work more closely together?
We're thinking 3 to 4 people, but if those people represent 3 to 4 agencies, amazing. I don't think they necessarily need to, though.
Great. And then we have another question that's asking, can you provide an example of a team structure and project focus that would be a good fit for this opportunity?
Can I punt that to you, Jesse? I know you have some examples handy.
Yeah, of course. So, we have some examples in the call for application. I would, encourage folks to look at that. But I want to start off by saying that we're very open to any kind of partnership that seems productive to applicants. And at this intersection, some things that I think that first of all, the paper that Claudia just talked about has a lot of examples, and she mentioned some, but some of the types of things that we think could work, as a partnership between a criminal court and a housing court focused on preventing evictions that result from involvement in the criminal justice system. Or a partnership between a parole agency and a public housing authority to establish a pilot program for supporting individuals who are coming home. A law enforcement agency working with a continuum of care to develop a new approach to responding to people living on the streets. A partnership between a homelessness response agency and a local jail system to address people who are cycling through those systems. These are just some examples, but again, very open and interested to hear what you all as experts and practitioners think makes the most sense for partnerships.
Great. And can you talk more about what the expectations are for the leads of each team?
Claudia, should I jump on that? So we would like teams to identify 3 or 4 folks who can really help move an initiative forward. So we're looking for people who are in positions where they have some authority to do that, where they're able to sort of garner the resources that are going to be needed for this process that we've outlined, and have some ability to do planning for the agencies where they work, and then folks who also have experience or at least a real interest in driving that kind of innovation. So like we mentioned earlier, the teams might very well end up being bigger than 3 or 4 people, certainly, especially as we work in phase 2 on actual planning. But the 3 or 4 people that will be on the core team should be the folks who are really in a position and interested in driving this forward.
Great. And are site visits included from the TA provider, or is all of the work included with the cohort remote?
I think we're envisioning fully remote. Yeah. We could very well see teams from across the country, and we're based here in New York, so we want to be inclusive and make sure that everyone has a comparable experience.
Great. And is this opportunity open to government agencies outside of New York who get HUD funding?
For sure, yes.
And then kind of talking again about geographies, One attendee mentions that they live in a rural county and their housing agencies operate out of an adjacent county. Could a team be members from multiple counties?
We would love to see regional collaboration. I think that would be great.
And we have another question that asks if the February 15th date is too soon for their agency to approach potential early stage partners, how can this interested person keep track of the next cohort for the Justice Network or the next call for applications?
So I will say it's February 14th, so mark your calendars. If you feel like you're not able to pull together a team by then, you might consider still submitting an application if you have a strong vision for what that team would be and think that you'll be able to pull those folks together. We'll be doing a series of calls with promising applicants. And so it will be a little while before we announce the finalists and then the ultimate team. I'm not sure that we know at this point whether there will be a future cohort. Our funders are funding only this cohort for the time being. I think we would be really excited to keep working with CJI, but that's kind of TBD at this point.
Great. And then I think to circle back to funding to make sure that we get all our ducks in a row on this. So we have an audience member asking where the funding comes from, their team or our agency.
So to participate in the network, there is no cost for jurisdictions. Of course, there's time, there's time and resources you'll have to commit to doing this work, but we are not imposing any costs. Our time on this project is being funded by foundation grants.
Great. Is there room for individuals with lived experience, either in the CJ system or experiencing homelessness, to be a part of this process in some way?
Absolutely. Yeah, as I mentioned, that was one of our findings from our research that having folks with lived experience involved in crafting and implementing the solution is key to success. So we would love to see teams that involve those folks. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thanks. Kind of jumping off that point too, is there an ideal representation of different types of stakeholders within each team or group?
I don't think so. Claudia, were you going to say something different?
No, I was going to ask for your thoughts. I don't think we, have set any criteria around that.
Yeah, again, very open. In the application, you have an opportunity to explain why you picked the people you picked, and we're very, certainly deferential to that and very interested to hear, what people think will make the strongest team in their particular context.
Great. And how many teams do we anticipate the network will start with?
We are aiming for 8 to 10 teams.
I think this is a question more towards the research that we've done. We have somebody who is a doctoral student who's interested in learning more about our research and wants to know how they can access it.
Yeah, I think we might have dropped the link in the chat. If it's not, yes, it's definitely in the chat. So check that out. I think we can put my email address in there too, though, because I'd be more than happy to chat with you.
Great. And then going back to the network requirements, and again, to make sure that we clarify all the eligibility requirements, If the city population is below 50,000, would they still be eligible to apply for the program?
Yes, there is no jurisdiction size, population size requirement.
Now we have a new question. Will this opportunity help us gain access to funding to implement the solutions we come up with?
I think we can help support
Yeah.
the jurisdictions thinking about that and strategizing around it. We don't have any particular access to funding sources or funders, though, that we'll be providing access to.
And then to talk about team structures again too, knowing that different areas have local governments that are structured differently, are there key governmental agencies that you recommend participate? For example, local police departments, housing authorities, aging office, etc.
It's going to depend so much on where you're headed and what solution you might be thinking of. So I think we're very flexible. We just ask that you make a case for the structure you come up with in your application.
Great. To talk a little bit about the eligibility requirements and our call for applications too. We know that we ask for teams with a demonstrated ability to bring housing and housing and criminal justice stakeholders to the table. How do you recommend people talk about that or represent that in their applications?
Well, we hope and expect that folks who are doing this work probably have experience doing that, even if they haven't done it necessarily in this cross-sector way, but in their existing work. Very interested to hear about people's how have they engaged with different partners and stakeholders of various types, and what strategies they have, even if they haven't done it in this particular context, what strategies they have or thoughts they have about how they would potentially go about it here.
And how defined do the potential solutions have to be in those initial applications to join the network?
Not very well defined. Part of this cohort is helping you really turn those initial ideas into something much more concrete. And so, again, we're looking for things that are in the early stages. You don't have to, have a new ordinance written to apply for this. Just a seed of an idea is fine.
Great. We're coming up on the last few minutes, so if you have any questions that are brewing in the audience, please put them into the Q&A section and we'll try and get to them. But in the meantime, does the network have a preference for working with projects that address a specific portion of the criminal justice system?
No, I mean, at this point, we don't. I mean, it's possible based on the set of applications we get that could change if we get a lot of applications with people struggling with a similar issue. But we are very open to working with people who are at any stage, working at any stage of the criminal legal system, criminal justice system, and also having there be a mix of folks in the cohort itself. It doesn't need to be that it's, everyone is working at the same stage.
Great. And will this opportunity include opportunities for people who are disabled, people with mental health considerations, and homeless veterans that may be interested in trying to get resources through initiatives like this?
Not totally sure I'm understanding the question. Could you say it again?
Yeah, I think this audience member maybe is interested in the overlap between people who are involved in the criminal justice system and people who may have disabilities and mental health considerations. And if there will be kind of considerations of those overlapping life circumstances within certain targeted people for these programs.
Okay, I think I understand, but Jesse, if you have thoughts to jump in. I think for the purposes of the application, we're really just looking for criminal justice involvement broadly and not prioritizing certain groups within that. But definitely wouldn't exclude applications that envision solutions that do focus on those groups. Do you have any other thoughts, Jesse?
Yeah, and I think that we also, of course, recognize that it's not like these are the only two intersecting systems. Obviously, there are many intersecting systems. So, to the extent that a team has representation from, other agencies or people who are working on a wider set of issues, that certainly, would be terrific. And then I don't know if the question is also getting at, working with people who have experienced these things. And I think that will absolutely be, as Claudia answered earlier, it would be terrific if there's people with the experiences of these systems on teams, if that makes sense. But that will absolutely be part of the work that we are doing, is thinking about and supporting teams in, bringing, folks who have experience of these systems into the planning process.
Great. And this may be one of our final questions, but to kind of round out kind of the expectations of the applications and where cities are at. So the question is, so do we need to identify an issue and form a solution, and then you will guide us with the implementation of this?
For the application, you absolutely do not need to have identified a solution. Part of the process will be both exploring the problem and then working to identify the solution you want to work on. So, I think the application will prompt you to think about the problem, but it's certainly, we're not expecting people to come into this knowing exactly what they want to do. But then through the process, and particularly in phase 2 of the process, there will be, the identification of a particular solution that then we will work on in depth.
Great, thank you. I think we've hit all the questions in the Q&A. Claudia or Jesse, do you have any kind of final words of advice or, considerations that you want to share with those who are interested in applying for this opportunity?
I would say if you have additional questions as you're working through the application, don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll try to be really responsive, and we're just grateful and happy for your interest.
Absolutely. I'll just echo that and also say, we very much do hope that there will be future cohorts. As Claudia said, we don't know that for sure, but more interest that we get for this one, more of a case we will make to be able to make to our funders that this is something that's needed. So definitely encourage everybody to apply. Thank you so much for being here. I think with that, we're done. Thank you, everybody. Bye.